talking about Jekyll and Hyde, and Robert Louis Stevenson was from Scotland. You know that I've been listening to an awful lot of serial killer podcasts.
Yes.
And one of the ones I was listening to today was about the Scottish serial killer who was called Bible John. And the thing that struck me as being quite peculiar about it is this is a man who picks young women up from nightclubs, rapes them, murders them with their own stockings. And the only thing that's unusual to him in Scotland is that he knows phrases from the Bible, hence his nickname. The rest of it is just a case of, oh, ginger bloke over there, yeah.
Isn't that with their own stockings? Wasn't the Boston Strangler? Didn't he do something like that? Oh,
they think it's some sort of way of evoking intimacy. Funnily enough, Bible John, he actually only went for women who were mothers and they had to be menstruating.
Wow.
Which, it's a niche audience, that.
So basically, it was a toss-up between him being called Bloody John and that bloody twat.
On the thing that I was listening to, they said he used to go to this particular nightclub, and he would go when it was the over 25 nights, because that was called, it's an area in Glasgow, and the over 25s, it was called the Grab a Granny Night. And I was thinking, well, in Glasgow, quite a lot of them are grannies by the time they get to 25.
Well, I always used to say, it's not just Glasgow, is it? I mean, Blackpool is like the second capital of Scotland. Yeah. And there are certain areas, and I always used to say when I used to like doing children's entertaining, and I used to love doing children's parties up on Grange Park, because you could actually do a 6-year-old's children party and entertain 4 generations at the same time, you know, because even 30-year-olds like it. And that is a bit of a subtle joke. There are people now going, what the... Hello.
Yes. So if you're Scottish and if you come from Grange Park, hit the like button, please.
Yes. Just don't hit us.
Yeah.
Smash the like button, not us. So brilliant. Well, I've thoroughly enjoyed what I've been reading this week. I hope you have as well. We're going to bring it in this week. We have been participating in the audio and reading delights of Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And for those that you don't know, a brief synopsis. Set in Victorian London, a bunch of well-to-dos start noticing a criminal type called Mr. Hyde lurking around. And after a particularly brutal incident where he beats the crap out of a girl that had the audacity to accidentally knock into him, they start investigating Mr. Hyde and actually find that he has links to a friend of theirs called Dr. Jekyll. Through the course of the book, everybody is very worried about Dr. Jekyll until they get to a point where he starts hiding away from everyone. He says he's going to break his associations with Mr. Hyde. And then they break into his room and they find Hyde dead in the room. And they then get a letter from Dr. Jekyll that is his confession. And then you move into the last part of it where he actually confesses that Hyde and Jekyll are the same person, that it was a drug created by Dr. Jekyll that turned him into Mr. Hyde. And this whole confession is spanned out into the last part of the book, which leaves them dumbfounded as to how this was even possible that they hadn't completely noticed. So the basic idea of the book is to have an exploration of the differences between good and evil in the personalities of one person and splitting them out. How's that, Dr. Lister?
That summed it up pretty adroitly for me. I think the story has become such a part of common culture now that it's a difficult read, because from page 1 you already know what the twist is going to be at the end.
Yes.
And the whole notion of building up narrative tension is pretty much a lost cause. Is this fair, or am I being really harsh here?
No, I think it's a very fair point, but I will counter that when you're done with this, because funnily enough, I was discussing this with a friend of mine recently. But carry on, and I'll come back because I think you'll like the counter.
No, yeah, that was basically all I was going to say. There was a hell of a lot of narrative tension in there, but for me, time and time spoilers have sort of like dissipated the narrative tension, so that the story only really kicked off in that final chapter when we're getting, and this is what really happened according to his letter.
Right. Okay. I mean, it's a very sort of valid point. Every time I look at this, I mean, I when I read it fresh a few years back, I didn't know that's how the book was. I was only from what the films were at the time.
Yeah.
And so I was quite surprised at how late you found out that they were both the same person, because the way that the story reads in that way is based on this idea of it becoming a twist at the end, where none of the film versions really went that far. They kind of concentrated almost like on the last chapter and just made it Dr. Jekyll's confession. However, I actually still like it. I actually still think it has a huge amount of tension with that, from the same point of, in the same way as watching The Shawshank Redemption for a second time, or watching an episode of Columbo. Because in Columbo, you know who's done it right at the beginning. The joy and the tension is finding out how Columbo works out who's done it.
Yeah,
so it's
absolutely.
not who's done it.
Yeah.
So when you kind of know that, that's coming, I found it really interesting, and still find it really interesting and quite tense to read how it sets everything up and how brutal Mr. Hyde is, and how nobody can put the two and two together. And when you start seeing the little pieces, there's a little part of being in the know of, I know that's the reason it's the hand is the same, because you know what's coming.
You're calling him brutal. He's killed a politician. Now, personally, I think in the current climate, that's something that we wouldn't sort of like necessarily see as a bad thing.
He's yes, but this is Victorian England, when in the society that he's in, it would be like, I don't know, Rees Mogg, really. It would be like, Jacob's Rees Mogg killing Boris Johnson. That's the kind of scenario that that would make a good book, but if
that was a death match on TV, I would watch the shit out of it. I would put money. In fact, I think we should be campaigning. That should be a TV show.
It should be, shouldn't it? So toffs, fighting toffs.
That should be how they elect the next cabinet. It shouldn't be one of these, it's my best mate that's getting in. It's Boris Johnson fights, and whoever sort of like beats him, yep, you've got a job in there.
Yeah, I think that beating is, when I was in Army Cadets, we used to have a game which was lift off the ground. Basically, you fought each other, and you had to lift the other person off the ground for 3 seconds, and that's how you won. It wasn't pin them down; you had to physically lift them. And I remember I accidentally won against this absolute. I hated playing it, really didn't like it. And this giant of a man, he was 18, and he was huge in comparison to me. And always, he was like Mr. Strong. He was square. And he came charging at me to completely pummel me. And I put my head down, and as he hit me, I stood up. And his momentum, it was almost like Dirty Dancing. His momentum took him up, and he just stayed up there for 3 seconds. So I had someone else come in and kick the shit out of me instead. So, but that was, that would be interesting to watch him do that, especially in the middle of Parliament as well. So you just on that podium.
Grabbing Black Rod's big Macy stick thing, and sorry, that was a digression, wasn't it?
It kind of suits. So look, I mean, from a point of view of enjoyment, you're saying that your enjoyment was tempered by history.
No, I enjoyed it. I thought it was well written. I've got a lot of love for Robert Louis Stevenson. I like the story itself. I just thought that I wasn't getting the full. If I'd lived 100 years ago or 130 years ago and seen it when it first came out, in that case, I think I would have gotten a lot more out of it than I do now, thinking, I know they're the same person, and I know this. Yeah, you get what I mean. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, I do get what you mean. And Yeah, I mean, could you imagine? I mean, it was published in 1886, so this is even before Dorian Gray came out. So, the idea of actually people being that horrendous as he is in that, would have been shocking to society at the time. So that was quite it was quite a leap that he made. But at the time, I think he would have definitely been seen as very much a completely separate person. I think now reading it, more than watching it, because when you watch it, it's a completely separate person, especially Sister Hyde, the 1972 Hammer film. I this time when I read it through, I actually had in my head something more about drug addiction and the second persona of someone who's a drug addict.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, and I thought that's something that you wouldn't have had at the time, and definitely don't get in the movies.
No, I think there's that strong suggestion of addiction, potentially to drugs, potentially to alcohol, potentially to any vice, really. And it's that vice that's sort of like coming through in everything that Hyde does. And I suppose that's one of the areas where I was wondering if he wrote it in, was it between 3 and 6 days, and then rewrote it in 3 or 6 days?
The story goes that he wrote a first draft, and he was like Stephen King and so many writers. His wife was always his first editor, and he presented it to his wife, and his wife thought it was so disgusting that she made him burn it, and he had to go and write it again in a much softer way. So that's a soft version that we have of it.
Yeah, she was called Fanny, which and I was looking at a couple of stories about that actually. So there's one. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Right. So in 2000, the letter was found in an attic with Fanny's thoughts on the book, and she'd put in this letter. He wrote nearly a quire of utter nonsense, she wrote to friend and poet W.E. Henley. Fortunately, he's forgotten all about it now, and I shall burn it after I show it to you. He said it was his greatest work. But there's also a story that Fanny criticised its failure to successfully execute the story's moral allegory.
Okay.
Amongst other things. Fanny later recounted that she then found her husband. I can't say Fanny without smirking. It's
such a child. So am I. That's not the point.
Fanny later recounted that she then found her husband sitting in bed with a thermometer in his mouth. He pointed to a pile of ashes in the fireplace, revealing he'd burned the draft. She said, "I nearly fainted away with misery and horror when I saw all was gone."
Oh.
So we've got contradictory stories. I mean, I'd heard the same as you. I'd heard that, she told him to burn it because it was so absolutely horrible. But yeah, we've got the two contradictory stories there.
So what I'm saying is, there's a story that was put out by the publisher that said the original draft was so much worse. This man is an amazing, grotesque writer. And then you got the other story where she's writing to her auntie going, well, he burnt it because it was shit, and had to write it again.
Yeah, pretty much. What I was going to say was, he'd written it in 3 days or 6 days, and the redraft was allegedly written 3 to 6 days. I think he could have spent a little bit more time working on a couple of the themes. We've got this whole notion that Hyde's coming out of him as the epitome of all the evil that's inside a person. Is that roughly correct?
Yeah, that's the moralistic side of it is to create that, isn't it? Because as Jekyll says in his confession at the end, that he actually he was able to do this under the guise of Hyde and not care about social constraints and do whatever he wants. And then when he was Jekyll again, he would then go out and be altruistic and give to charity and be absolutely fantastic. So it does create the absolute polar opposites of good and evil.
But are they? I mean, if we remove everything from Dr. Jekyll that's evil and bad? Are we left with something that's the personification of good? Or surely there's a middle ground somewhere in there? I mean, did you ever watch that Red Dwarf episode where, and I appreciate we're going from the sublime to the ridiculous.
But there's the sublime of Red Dwarf.
Yes.
Yeah.
The Red Dwarf episode where they split Red Dwarf into two.
Yes.
And there's a completely good one and a completely bad one. And they realize that they are composites of the completely good and completely bad. Whereas in Jekyll and Hyde, Hyde is completely bad and all the bad things, but Jekyll is just the middle ground.
Yeah, well, I think the thing is, isn't it, is that's the way that things are perceived when you, like when I was reading it this time, is Hyde isn't all the bad. Hyde is actually acting as base, so to speak. So he's kind of like, he's acting upon what Jekyll wants to do. He's kind of, he's basically stating he's taken his moral shackles off and therefore he doesn't like anyone. He's basically what most of us want to do when walking around Asda. And you're constantly bombarded by people being really just like selfish around you and pushing you out the way in order to get their tins of beans. I'd just like to state there are other supermarkets I'd like to kill people in as well. But it's more like that. It's the shackles being taken off and kind of showing us not as being bad and evil, but kind of showing what humans are as creatures and animals, as opposed to being just going out and being deliberately bad. I mean, he beats the child, within an inch of its life because they just happened to fall into each other. He didn't go looking for a child and he didn't go really looking for the MP. Again, it was one of those, he got angry and he lost control. That's the thing. So it's more the shackles being taken off, I think.
And yeah, we've all nearly beaten a child to death and nearly beaten an MP to death. So I think we can empathise with him, certainly on those levels. And yeah, I mean, I do think I'm not criticising the story. I'm not having a go. I just thought that I just would have expected us to be able to extrapolate something from a pure and pious, good Jekyll, as opposed to him just being, I don't know, it's almost like he's the goodness and the detritus of what's not evil left inside a person.
Yes. I totally agree with you. He's not angelic. He's not, he isn't completely altruistic, and it does open up those kind of things. And like you say, the Red Dwarf episode really sums it up really nicely. It comes with that, you've got the Eastern philosophy of yin yang, where, which also has that, that same idea that there's always a bit of good and a bit of bad in everything that comes out. And the philosophical question of, can you ever truly have an altruistic society? Because even when you're giving money to charity, and this is what, I mean, absolutely, and what Dr. Jekyll's doing, is quite often, you're not giving money to charity because you want them to be better. You're giving it to make yourself feel better. I remember Ben Elton once said he does a lot for homeless charities once he became, a wealthy entertainer, not because he wanted to do well for the homeless. It's that he wanted to stop stepping over them when he was coming out of the expensive restaurant. So you have that kind of kindness in not caring. And that does come across. The character of Dr. Jekyll is not a very massively charitable person at all. He's doing it because Hyde is making him do it, because he's, he's feeling guilty of what Hyde's done, not because he's inherently good. So I think you're right there. It's not really a polar opposite.
When we were talking about this before we actually read it, you were saying that there were things that they always get wrong in the films.
Yeah, I think the most important thing in this, and when you read it, is this idea of addiction, because it's where they always get it wrong in the films is they always concentrate on the split of the personality and state that what he's done is he's created this drug that splits the personality, a la Hulk, because the Incredible Hulk is along that same kind of line, isn't it, where it's different parts of the human makeup that's going on. But what they miss is the fact that Jekyll loses control of when he turns and actually has to start taking a drug to stop him turning. And that's the bit that's really key, I think, when he goes into the confession, because on the lead up to it is that whole not knowing. It's all about how dangerous Hyde is and how worried everybody is about Jekyll because he's associating with this Hyde fella. But all the films don't really go into that in any great depth. They kind of jump onto the science side of it very, very quickly. But the book doesn't have that much of the science side in it because it's told from somebody else's perspective for most of it.
Yeah, all the book does is say he's picked up some dodgy salts that, one of the things I think we never see in the films, and it's funny you should mention the Hulk, is the fact that Hyde is so small compared to Dr. Jekyll that he's almost like a dwarf in comparison to him. Whereas,
that's how he's described, yeah.
Yeah, it was the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, the character of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Again, it's like a Victorian version of the Hulk, isn't it? The way he sort of like rips out the clothes. And yeah, we do have this suggestion that evil usually comes in big muscular form, but this is in small, compact muscular form.
Yes, and it's this is where I talk about the addiction side of things, and I think that's, you're absolutely right with that description. Is if you have ever encountered someone who has a terrible addiction, in particular something like a heroin addiction or crack addiction, you find that if you haven't seen them for a while and they've become that addicted, and then you go and see them, it's like looking at a completely different person. They're thin, they're frail, they look smaller than they were before, and it's hard to even recognize them. And it is like the description of Hyde in the book, where Hyde is this detestable little wiry man. And, and that's where I started looking at it from that point of view on this read, it's more like a drug addiction. He buys a drug and then it starts turning him into Hyde. So basically the effects of the drug turn him into a person who doesn't give a toss and goes out and speaks people up, PCPs, does that sort of thing. But then as it goes along, he starts losing control of when he becomes Hyde and starts taking the drug just to be Jekyll, which is drug addiction. That's the absolute allegory of drug addiction. So that in the end, he's taking it just to be normal.
Yeah, it's to be a functional, functional whatever addiction it is that he's got.
Because alcoholism does the same thing. You see, it has a seriously huge physical effect on the person. If you get someone who's seriously, not the one glass of wine every night and can't cope with that one glass of wine, which is still alcoholism, but the one that completely consumes them. And that's what the book, I think, gives you over what the films do, in that it's not just an exploration of good and evil, that it is an exploration of drug addiction. Remember, this is 1886, where you could walk into Harrods and buy morphine in a bottle of milk, and buy cocaine in a hamper, the good old days, as I like to call them.
A hamper of cocaine, please. Yes.
Well, in 1914, you could actually buy it. It was called the front. It was the hamper for the boys on the front, and you could buy one and actually write on what regiment they were in, and Harrods would send it. And it was just basically a hamper full of drugs to send to the guys in the front line.
I still don't think that would have made up for it. I think I would have been, I would have been there thinking, no, they're making me play fucking football on Christmas Day. They're shooting at me. My feet are rotting off. I love
that. I love the fact it's not the million people that died. They made me play football on Christmas Day. That's the thing.
Yep, priorities. But yeah, I think the notion of addiction in this, I think it's so well represented. One of the things that I also liked was, and I know I belittled it a little bit earlier, saying that he could have done with thinking about it a bit more, but I did like the duality that we got with Utterson and his companion, both being so completely opposite poles of the spectrum, and they're who are used to actually narrate this story.
Yeah,
I thought that was quite a nice, clever touch, and yeah, it got a lovely meta feel to it.
Yes, yeah, and it also, I thought, added gravitas to the confession at the end when you actually had Jekyll's voice right at the end. It gave that position, that I suppose it's a juxtaposition, isn't it, where you had their voices going on all the way through. So he was able to write it in a completely different way in that last part of it, and you really got the feeling that you were reading a confession that was, you know, at the end of it from someone different. So it was a nice, clever mechanism.
Yeah, I thought that worked exceptionally well. Damn it, there was something I was just going to say then. It was going to be a really, really fucking good point too. I'd impressed myself with it so much, and it's just gone out of my head. Drugs, violence.
Sounds like you're making a shopping list now.
Was it? It wasn't the violence. It definitely. No, it'll come back to me in a minute. It'll come back to me.
So, well, let's just discuss the violence for a second, because, you know, as horror writers that we are, that violence is something that we have to write from time to time. And I thought he was brutally efficient with the way that he wrote about the violence, which is what made it so shocking. And it was also in a witness testimony as opposed to it really happening. When he kills the MP, it's people described it as like he was attacking, like he was some sort of chimpanzee, you know, beating down on him like an ape. And the idea that he's got this thick black wooden walking cane that snaps in the ferocity of the attack as well, and that gives you the it's like used as almost like a metaphor for the bones of the MP that he is absolutely brutalizing at the time. So but they are quick and they are sharp in the way that he describes it, which I think is what makes it even more shocking in the violence itself.
It was actually reminiscent of an account of prior to the American Civil War. There was a man, can't remember names, but one of the senators or governors stood up, made a speech, and I think he made a speech against slavery, saying, you know, slavery's not a particularly good thing. We don't want slavery to happen. One of his opponents was so outraged by this, he stood up, beat 7 shades of shit out of this bloke with a stick that he was carrying. And the stick was actually shattered, with, as you say, with the ferocity of the attack. Then a lot of people who supported this this gentleman's point of view that, yeah, slavery is a good thing, sent him sticks to replace the one he'd broken, which, and then they went on to vote for Trump. So, yeah.
Look, I mean, joking aside, because, you know, we do a lot of messing about, of, you know, wanting to beat up MPs and stuff like that, is there are moments, aren't there, when you look at things like history, you look at things like, you know, the times when Jekyll and Hyde was written, for example, and it is such a different world and it is such a different time that when acts like that still happen today, it's even more shocking. You know, it's like, I mean, I, unlike you, am a football fan, and I still find it shocking when they have the racial abuse from the stands. You know, it's just and any like decent-minded person would find that absolutely shocking, and then find it shocking that people complain that the players are taking the knee. It's like, why? What's to complain about? It's still amazing me. So the idea that, oh, he beat someone to near death and he's lost his stick, but we agree with what he says about the blacks, so therefore let's send him a new stick. You know,
it's outrageous.
Yeah,
I mean, fortunately, I think part of the reason why it shocks us so much more nowadays is because we think we've moved away from that level of barbarity. We think, yeah, we should be above and beyond that. And when something happens that shows that some aspects of society aren't particularly above and beyond that, it's just a bloody hell. Why haven't we progressed? We have progressed. It's just that it's a slow process. And I've remembered the thing I was going to ask you about.
Oh.
Right. The psychology. So this was written 1880 something.
1886 is when it was published. Yeah.
So we're looking at a time when Freud was doing a lot of his writing, and we're getting these whole notions of Freudian psychology. Do you think there's any Freudian psychology within this story?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely ego and id going on, isn't there? Because because the ego, I think it's about which way round you look at it, isn't it? The ego is Jekyll and the id is Hyde, from my understanding of it, because the ego wants to be stroked. So he goes out and he's like, I'll give the money to the poor child's family. I'll embrace all this sort of stuff. I'll make right what Hyde has done. And I
didn't know he was going out because he wants to be stroked.
Well, it was Victorian times. You could get stroked in the fog quite easily back then. Ask them down on... no, I won't. I think it was called Cuntliff Street in London, something like that.
Cunt Grope Street.
Cunt Grope Street, thank you, yes.
Yes.
That was it. That's where old Jack used to hang out. And, so did a lot of his victims used to hang out after meeting him as well. But because the id, the id is quite a nasty part of the psychology, as I understand it correctly. Your ego is all flamboyant and wonderful, and your id is like you're in you're not very good, are you? Because that was that Red Dwarf. It's going back to the Red Dwarf again, isn't it? That was the ego and the id.
I was just thinking, and that was the ego, the id, and the superego. Which is sort of like acts as the policeman to control everything, and so I think that actually was quite a common theme on Red Dwarf, wasn't it? Because even in one of the early ones, one of them gets a cold that.
He's got the ego, and then the id is there going, "Oh, you can't do anything, Lister." And then the other one's going, "Oh, you don't need air. You're Dave Lister. Who needs air?" And all that sort of stuff.
This is making me want to watch a lot more Red Dwarf, really. And I didn't think that was going to be. With the psychology, one of the things that struck me is the first time we encounter Hyde is when he's right. I'm not saying this to be all Frankie Howard and Misses, but we first encounter Hyde when he's going into Dr. Jekyll's back door, and.
Yes,
Dr. Jekyll's back door is a very unkempt back passage that's sort of like been scratched. It's had sort of like tramps laying about in there. It's had young boys kicking around in there. It's not a very pleasant place.
No.
But the front of the house looks gorgeous. The front of the house, which is Dr. Jekyll's side of it. And it's almost as though we're seeing that representation of the things that we keep hidden from people, that should be kept hidden from people, and the things that should be presented to people, the lovely, pretty things.
Yes, it's the idea of the swan, isn't it? Elegant on the top and like kicking like frantic,
like a bastard. Yeah.
But I was just thinking of the innuendo side of things, because there's a wonderful bit written later on, isn't it, when they suddenly make the connection that it's Jekyll's back door. Because they didn't know when he goes in, and this is this one bit when he says, "I didn't know this was a quick way into Jekylls."
Yeah. If anything, the 21st century has really fucked over some literature just with
with us being kids, basically. Absolutely fantastic.
Much,
Well, talking about being kids, there's also in the middle of it, Robert Louis Stevenson. He wrote that Castaway one.
Treasure Island.
Hey?
Love Island.
He wrote Love Island, and he wrote then he wrote that other one, because it's Treasure Island, wasn't it? And he wrote the one Robinson Crusoe.
Yes.
Yeah.
That was Daniel Defoe.
Oh, sorry.
Daniel Defoe.
I knew it was someone who starred in Spider-Man. Anyway, so the pun. There's a wonderful pun in it, where he does where the guy says, "Well, if you are Mr. Hyde, I'm going to be Mr. Seek."
Yes.
And goes to find him. And that's what I thought. This is very Columbo. The way.
Yeah. I got to admit, I heard that part and I thought, wow, he must have been so. I know when I write something like that, I'm there thinking, I'm going to show this to some bastard and grin whilst I'm. Yeah, he must have been so excited when he got that line up.
Yeah, I bet it's one of those when everyone reads it and they sort of like coming, Robert, we really like your book. Yeah, but did you see this on page 36?
Hyde, seek, get it. Do you want me to draw a picture? Get it. I've got another here that says the story came to Stevenson in a dream. He'd long been fascinated with split personalities, couldn't figure out how to write about them. Then one night he had a dream about Jekyll and Hyde. And we've got a quote again. In the small hours of one morning, I was awakened by cries of horror from Louis, his wife Fanny said. Thinking he had a nightmare, I awakened him. He said angrily, why did you wake me? I was dreaming a fine bogey tale. And Stevenson later elaborated on the dream in an essay called A Chapter on Dreams. But yeah, so he got woken out of his dream by Fanny, who thought he was having a nightmare.
And all the time, he was just, beating off an MP.
Not the first person to be doing
Not in
that.
Victoria and London. Mm.
Yeah, just unusual to be doing it near a Fanny, I suppose. We've also got, and I mentioned that part about the dream just because we try and discuss inspiration on here to some extent. And
the word try in that.
Yeah, that was doing a lot of the heavy lifting in that sentence. But whilst he's saying it came to him in a dream, also we've got this whole notion that he was fascinated by split personality anyway.
Yes.
And it's almost as though the fruition of his notions about split personality are coming to a head during the dream.
Yes.
Which I think the whole notion of dreaming up a plot idea is a great one, but what really happens is we think of a plot idea and we think, oh, could this work? Could that work? And then sometimes it will clarify in our dreams.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for that. I mean, I'm quite good at remembering some of my dreams, but I think that the most that you ever usually get out of a dream is if you're Paul McCartney, it's a song or a scene. You might dream a scene and go, oh, that's how I get this. I've done that myself, where you sit there going, I've got a story idea, I can't make it work. And you'll dream a scene that will make it go, that's how I can fit it all together. So you haven't dreamt the whole thing. You've managed to, your brain has managed to work out in its subconscious how to make the story work in that way.
Yeah.
But I also think the drug thing is a big, big thing, because that's why the Sherlock Holmes talks about the different personalities that Sherlock has when he's, with injecting cocaine and smoking his opiums.
Cocaine. Glad you mentioned that.
So you went silent there for a second. I saw your mouth move, but didn't hear anything.
Cocaine.
Yes.
Cocaine. Glad you mentioned it. Yes. Yes. So in the book, Dr. Jekyll takes a drug from a chemist that turns him into another person. He likes it until he loses control of the drug. Stevenson may have been drawing from personal experience, because it's been reported he was prescribed medicinal cocaine to treat his hemorrhage. Hemorrhage, not hemorrhoids, completely different things. Discovered in the 1880s that cocaine tightens blood vessels, and that the inspired dream for the story occurred during a cocaine-fueled slumber.
Makes perfect sense.
Stevenson later professed an affection for the drug, and his crazy writing stint is consistent with someone on cocaine. Then again, it's also consistent with a man faced with financial problems and his own mortality, swept up by inspiration and a great idea. But yeah,
to be perfectly honest with you, writing a story in 6 days, burning it, and then writing another one in 6 days does strike, cocaine.
It does, doesn't it? Yeah.
It definitely, there's definitely something going on there that's raising the heart rates. And to me, I think the whole story reads that way in what we know now from a historical point of view. Back then, he would have been looking at the way that people were changing on drugs, the way that he felt he was changing on drugs, and that's manifested itself in that way. And I think Oscar Wilde does it later as well with the picture of Dorian Gray, where everyone's going out being wild and being completely off their heads, and he was just thinking of a way of how do you stay looking young yet do all this stuff, which obviously he was observing ages people prematurely. So, the idea of disfigurement through chemistry is definitely something that was playing on their minds, because they were fucking dabbling with it all the time.
I'm glad you said disfigurement, because that's reminded me of one of these striking things, that people have got this automatic reaction against Hyde, that he's somehow, what's the word that they use?
I know what you mean, because they're actually saying, but he isn't. They're saying it's almost like he is completely disfigured, but isn't. Yeah,
it's almost as though he's got a disability and they're not treating him with any empathy. They're just sort of like shying away from him, as though, no, he's got the lurgy, this bloke.
Yeah.
Which, again, reading it from a 21st century perspective, we're sort of like seeing the lack of empathy that the most empathetic characters in there are supposed to have. But also, that's making me think I've got a very stupid liberal attitude towards things with, why aren't we giving Mr. Hyde hugs? I'm sure he'll like that and he'll stop beating the crap up.
Well, there was a Conservative MP, wasn't there, down in Cornwall? I don't know the names of Conservative MPs, and I'm proud of myself for that. But he was complaining that the University of Bath was teaching people that Frankenstein is actually the true monster of the book. Go figure. I think you're right. I actually think there is. I don't think it was at the time. I don't think this was what Stevenson was considering at the time, was the empathy for Hyde. But reading it from a modern perspective, you can really kind of get this idea that, yes, he's become this detestable drug addict. And, he is obviously on, just trying to go out and do whatever he wants to do because he's had those morals taken away from him. But the attitudes of the people around him as well, because he's not seen as being part of that top-hatted gentry that was strolling the streets of London back then. He was kind of like, his friends were worried, Jekyll's friends were worried because he was associating with someone of that ilk. There's a lot of that. There's definitely kind of layers of classism going on within what's going on with Hyde as well. And maybe that's what the first draft was. Maybe he didn't kill an MP and beat a kid. Maybe he was just going out on the street and everyone was just being horrible to him. And his wife was there going, why are people, you can't do that, but that's the way it was, wasn't it?
And I think that's one of the reasons why it stood the test of time, the fact that it's such an accurate representation of what would have occurred at the time. And we can sort of like see how society treats people who are different. And I do think his description within it is absolutely perfect. I think, but I think it's easier to empathise with Hyde than it is with Jekyll. I think, like you said,
you never know Jekyll. In the whole book, you never get to know him. You don't know him post addiction at all because you never meet him. The only time you see him is in his confession.
And he's just presented as somebody who's bland and anodyne and has been doing good work, whereas Hyde, I've walked around a corner, bumped into a kid, and little bastard's been under my feet and should have been watching where it was going. And I've not trampled over it like a juggernaut, but part of me has been thinking, do you know what? Kick the little shit out of the way.
There's a modern thing. Thank you if you just put that one in my head. There's a modern thing. He beats the child and then pays the parents off. They negotiate him up to £100, don't they, for the NDA? Yeah. It reeks of the kind of the Epstein and the I hate my brain for not remembering names sometimes. Prince Andrew's part of it is the Brian Epstein and the Harvey Weinstein.
Yeah.
And, that whole kind of idea that, I'm going to do something wretched and then I'm going to pay them off so that they're not going to, do. And that's through the book as well. Actually, to be perfectly honest, I've changed my mind. I actually think maybe Stevenson, I'm doing him a disservice, and maybe he was highlighting that as a point and nobody really was noticing it, because he talks about his standing. He talks about Jekyll's standing. He talks about, his name. He talks about his credit. And even in his even in his confession at the end, the confession is all about hiding what has happened. Hyde, it's that, maybe what he was doing wasn't actually looking at an individual person and the little bad and good side of it. Maybe he was doing what the Who did with Tommy, because Tommy's not just an individual on that album. It's about the society being deaf, dumb and blind to what was going on at the time. So maybe that's what he was doing. Maybe Jekyll and Hyde is actually about society at the time. Maybe he was saying that Hyde is actually the true face of what was going on the dark streets of London at night with all these gentry types, and Jekyll was the front of it that was paying everybody off so that nobody spoke about it.
Yeah, that nice oily veneer of respectability.
Yeah, which we still get today. That's still now in the movies and music industries and all the Me Too and all the the Black Lives Matter and everything that goes on. That is the lower class have always sort of like put down, and you wave a bit of money at them because they're poor and everything goes away. So maybe it was, which again is what Dorian Gray's kind of like, isn't it? Do what you want and have no consequences because you've got this portrait. And Jekyll and Hyde is doing the same thing. Hyde does what he wants and Jekyll pays to make sure that it goes away.
It's that paying and enabling through payment. The fact that first payment comes out of Jekyll's account.
Yes.
And then Jekyll provides finances so that Hyde's got his own account. So it's concealing the fact that Jekyll is still enabling him. Yes. Which, there was one other point I'd picked up. Influence. It might have come from a cabinet that Robert Louis Stevenson had when he was a child.
Right.
So many historians apparently speculate that the duality was inspired by an 18th century Edinburgh cabinet maker named Deacon Brody, a respectable town councillor and an extremely successful craftsman. Brody's job gave him access to the keys of the rich and famous, which he made copies of in order to rob them at night. And after a string of heists, he was eventually caught and hanged, according to legend, on a gallows that he'd helped design. Brody's story fascinated the people of Edinburgh, including Stevenson, even though the thief had died 60 years before Stevenson was born. But he grew up with a Brody cabinet in his room. And in 1880, he co-wrote a play called Deacon Brody or the Double Life. But the cabinet owned man. So, perhaps that was an early version of his Jekyll and Hyde story.
Maybe. I think there's a real good case for, and you know this, you've been asked this several times as a writer when people go, where do you get your inspiration from? And you got I was eating a bean sandwich or something, if that's a thing. I'm going to invent one now. Baked bean sandwiches, right?
Make two, please.
So
that's a big sandwich
thing, is it? Yeah, that's what I'm fucking imagining, this bloody sandwich now. That's what it goes. Maybe I should write a children's story, Colin and the baked bean sandwich. Anyway, I need a wicked stepmother. So if it doesn't come from one source, when you get inspired by things, there's a lot of things that kind of come together that sit on top of other things as they go along. And here, I think, in deconstructing the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, I think we have. I mean, that story is absolutely wonderful and would be something, as a writer, you go finding these tiny little stories, whether they're true or not, we don't care. We just like stories. Hence the reason we were quite happy to believe that his wife, Fanny, was, and just to make that point, is we're finding it funny for one reason. Anyone watching this in America is finding that funny for a different reason, but still as funny. The idea that it was horrendous and burnt it is a lovely story. And it's a story that inspires us and that sits in the back. And we kind of like the idea, and that will play on top of other things. So maybe that was where he got his dual personality. Maybe he was always fascinated at how he got away with it, getting these keys off someone. And that was playing on top of him. And then he sees the same thing happen again with the drugs going on. And he sees the same thing happen again when he's moving in those kind of social circles. And one thing on top of another thing on top of another thing. Then that's where that inspiration comes from. So it's not, when anyone says, where do you get your ideas from? you know, you got to sit there and go, well, probably about 30 years worth of other little stories I've heard along the line, just to get to this that one little idea.
I mean, when I wrote Raven and Skull, the original idea came with, I'd given my mother a lift home, and she told me that she was worried that people were dying because she'd been doing knitting. And she thought it was her knitting that was affecting people's lives. So I first thought mental as fucking biscuits. And then I thought this would be a great idea for a story, and used that as the first story in Raven and Skull. But the rest of it's all about the horrors of working in an office. And that's come from decades of working in offices and understanding just how horrific it actually is to work in a fucking office.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're absolutely right.
It goes into the same sort of thing. I mean, you can go, and like I say, I know it's a book you don't particularly like, but American Psycho, you could almost argue, is a modern retelling of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde from that point of view, as it's that one personality that people see in the office and another personality that's going on in the streets at night. And
absolutely, yeah,
you know, but that, you know, and just all these different influences that move that way. And again, you can see that's a satirical look at 1980s greed culture. And you say you were inspired by the idea of killing people by knitting, and your love for portmanteau movies, you know, and that kind of came together in and the absolute hell that is working in an open plan office. You know. So yeah, it's you can see how it's merging ideas, isn't it? And I think when we were looking at Poe in The Fall of the House of Usher, there was loads of where the people saying, "Oh, he's just ripped off the idea," and you saying, "No, it's not a ripped off idea." And I think now we've moved into this one. There's a bit of a longer piece and a bit more time to breathe when he's writing it, even though he's written it in double quick cocaine time. Is you can see how there's multiple influences coming into the melting pot on this one, like you were saying with Raven and Skull. And I think also with your most recent series, The Dark Tales of Innsmouth, also has this kind of, as you're looking at it, you are looking at influence from H.P. Lovecraft, which is the obvious one, but you've also got influences of academic life as a professor, academic life as a student, living in a small town. All these different things are melted on top of each other rather than it being one just singular idea. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And we will probably end up talking more about that next week because I've got another another story lined up for us. Well, I tell you what, we could talk. I actually think we could talk about Jekyll and Hyde so much because it's such an in-depth thing, but we'll draw this to a close at this moment in time. We might return in a different way to Jekyll and Hyde as a kind of like pot of maybe 3 or 4 different stories later on, where we're not going to necessarily read the stories. We're going to discuss how the stories link with each other. Would be quite interesting. Yeah. So next week, there we go. This is my exciting. I love this when you're picking them. Come on.
Next week, Call of Cthulhu.
Nice. Yes.
Yeah. Bit of Lovecraft, and probably one of his most famous stories. And yeah, I thought it would be. As
you know, I'm a role player, and the Call of Cthulhu is absolutely entrenched in the whole role playing genre. There's a whole field of it, and I write role playing stories based on the Cthulhu mythos as well. So thank you. I'm really looking forward to that.
Yeah, I've got to admit, I'm looking forward to listening to that at the gym. Yeah,
and he's going to be coming out next week.
Perfect. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely fantastic. Brilliant. Well, that's brilliant. Well, I'm going to say the short story's still up for grabs. All you got to do is comment, and then we will comment on that, telling you how to get it, which is also, if you don't want to comment and you just want to get it, direct message either Books by Ash or Books by Ash Lister or Books by Colin Davis, and we will send you the short story free of charge. When we hit 25 subscribers, I will then send out a free copy of Blood Ink on Kindle. And when we hit 30, we're going to get a free copy of
Raven and Skull audio book,
which is what we've just been talking about, read by the author himself, Ashley Lister, as well. So
Yep, and I've stuttered most of the way through it, so it's a longer version. Yeah.
Rather than the abridged one, which is just read normally. Yeah, that was absolutely fantastic. I have thoroughly enjoyed this talk.
Yeah. Loved this one. Yep, absolutely. Yeah, and loved the book though. Great choice. And yeah, it was so much fun going back to it.
Yes.
And no, thank you. Excellent choice.
It was.
And
very rich.
Hit the like buttons, please, wherever the hell the like buttons are. Please
subscribe, and bells and whistles and all that, and share us around the place. Seriously,
tell friends.
Yeah.
Tell friends. Tell people you don't like. That'll show up.
Tell everybody.
Yeah.
And we managed to do it without an intermission this time as well, which is quite fun.
Yes. Yeah. I was thinking of doing an intermission, but no, I've kept my legs crossed and just sold myself.
Brilliant. Fantastic. Okay. See you next time. Bye.
See you next time. Bye.